I never thought my own accent, the voice I carried across oceans, would become the reason my son's wife tried to erase me. She mocked the way I spoke, turned my words into jokes, and nearly convinced my son to sell the very home I built from nothing. But she didn't know I had another language, one she could never twist. And the moment I finally spoke it, everything changed. My son saw the truth, their marriage cracked open, and the legacy she tried to bury rose to protect us both. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke in the one she never expected. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing the dinner, humming softly as I moved from stove to counter, the familiar rhythm of cooking grounding me in a way little else could. My hands worked with practiced ease, chopping vegetables the way my own mother taught me, seasoning the stew with the same methodical care I had carried from my childhood into adulthood. Tonight was important. My son and his new wife were coming over for their first dinner as a married couple, and even though I had only met her briefly during the wedding whirlwind, I wanted her to feel welcomed, truly welcomed, into our family. By the time the doorbell rang, the house smelled of garlic and slow-cooked broth. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door, smiling wide as I saw my son standing there, his arm draped casually around his wife's shoulders. She stepped inside with a quick glance around my living room, her eyes sharp, almost assessing. I brushed it off and led them to the dining table I had set with my best dishes. For the first half hour, everything felt pleasant enough. I asked her about her new job, and she answered politely if somewhat dismissively. My son chimed in with stories from work, and I laughed at all the right moments, letting the warmth of his familiar voice fill the room. I kept noticing how he looked at her. Proud, hopeful. Softened me. It made me want to try harder. The shift happened when I offered her more food. I said something simple, something I had said 100 times in my life. "You want more stew?" She paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. A small smirk curled at the corner of her lips. Then, in a sing-song voice, exaggerated and sharp, she repeated my words back to me, twisting them into a caricature of my accent. "You want more stew." My son froze. The laughter came first, from her. A short, amused burst, as if she had made the most harmless joke. Then she looked at my son, expecting him to join her. He didn't. The room changed instantly. The air thickened, conversation halted, and all at once I felt the weight of every year I had carried that accent, every mile I had traveled with it, every sacrifice it represented. Something in my chest tightened. Not anger, not yet, but a deep, private hurt that settled beneath my ribs. I forced a small smile, the kind mother's practice out of necessity, and continued eating. My hands felt suddenly clumsy around the fork. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and didn't care. She kept talking as if nothing had happened, as if the sound of her own voice was more important than the silence she had created. My son glanced at me several times, guilt creeping into his expression, but he said nothing. And in that moment, between her careless laughter and his quiet cowardice, I felt something inside me shift. A thin line, invisible but real, quietly broke. Dinner continued, but it was not the same. The warmth I had prepared the meal with slowly dissolved, replaced by a cold truth settling into the corners of the room. This woman did not respect me. And my son, for reasons I would soon learn, was already forgetting the language of home, respect, gratitude, and the simple kindness of knowing when someone's heart has been wounded. The house felt unbearably quiet after they left, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood at the doorway for a long moment after closing it behind them, listening to the fading engine of their car until it disappeared completely. Only then did I move back into the kitchen, where the remnants of the evening still lingered. The half-filled glasses, the serving bowls still warm, the chair she'd sat in pushed slightly away from the table as though she couldn't wait to leave. I began clearing the dishes slowly, not because there were many, but because my body suddenly felt heavier, as if something inside me had dropped without warning. Each clink of china felt louder than the last. I kept replaying her voice, her smirk, the way she tilted her head as she mimicked me. It was such a small moment, just one sentence, twisted and stretched for her own amusement, but it echoed in my mind with a sharpness I couldn't shake. I had lived with my accent my entire life. It had been with me through every chapter. The dusty streets of my childhood, the classroom where I learned my first English words, the factory where I worked night shifts as a young woman trying to build a future, the hospital where my son was born and I whispered promises to him in the language of my mother. My accent was not something I ever saw as a flaw. It was a map back to where I came from, a reminder of the battles I fought and the bridges I crossed. But tonight it felt like something dirty. Something that could be mocked openly in my own home, in front of my own son, without consequence. I rinsed a plate and set it on the rack, watching the water swirl down the drain. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I reached up to touch my jaw, the same place where I had felt her words land like invisible stones. For the first time in my life, I caught myself wishing I sounded different, smoother, more like her. Someone whose words didn't betray where they were born. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one where my son used to do his homework while I cooked. Back then, he would ask me to speak in our old language so he could practice. He used to love the sound of it, the way it rolled like a song. I wondered when that changed. I wondered when my voice stopped being something familiar and became something he allowed others to ridicule. The clock ticked loudly above me, each second pulling me deeper into a kind of reflection I wasn't prepared for. I pressed my palms together and bowed my head, letting the sting of the moment settle fully, letting myself feel the hurt instead of brushing it aside as I often did. My accent had carried me through a life that was not easy. Held memories, history, roots. It was part of my identity, stitched into every story I had ever told. But that night, sitting alone in my dim kitchen, I felt an unfamiliar shame wrap itself around my voice. And for the first time I whispered a sentence aloud, testing it with a careful tongue. Maybe I should speak less. The words tasted bitter. But the feeling behind them, raw, quiet and aching, was real. He showed up the next afternoon without calling first, something he hadn't done in years. I heard the knock while I was folding towels in the living room, and for a moment I considered not answering. My heart was still tender from the night before, and I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine. But habit is a powerful force, especially for a mother, so I wiped my hands on my skirt and opened the door. He stood there with that familiar sheepish smile, the one he used to use when he broke something as a child and hoped charm would soften the blow. He stepped inside before I could say anything, giving the room a quick once-over as though searching for clues to my mood. "Hey, Mom," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "About last night. I just wanted to talk." I nodded and gestured for him to sit, though my hands felt stiff. He glanced at the kitchen table as if the memory of the dinner still lingered there, too. "She didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly, the words spilling out before any real thought could form behind them. "You know how she is, she jokes a lot. She didn't think you'd take it so personally." I felt something inside me tighten again. I sat down across from him, studying the face I once knew better than my own. The same eyes, the same tilt of his chin, but something had shifted with time, an invisible layer of distance, a kind of polished surface hiding the boy I raised. "So personally," I repeated softly, testing the phrase as if it were unfamiliar. "Your wife mocked the way I speak, the way I've spoken my whole life, the way you spoke when you were little." He flinched a little but tried to recover with a small laugh. "Come on, Mom. It's not that deep. Lots of people joke about accents. It's normal. Normal." The words sat between us like a stone. I watched him fidget, tapping his fingers against the table the way he used to do when he didn't want to confront something difficult. I could see he didn't come to defend me. He came to manage me, to smooth things over before his wife complained that I was upset. "You know she likes you," he continued, forcing lightness into his tone. "She just doesn't always think before she talks. I'm sure she didn't mean to embarrass you." Embarrass. Another word he tossed out casually, as if acknowledging the truth but trimming its edges so it hurt less. Or so he hoped. I leaned back, taking a slow breath. "Do you think it embarrassed her? Sitting at my table, eating food I cooked, hearing my voice?" He looked startled, as though I had struck a match in a room he thought was dark. No, that's not what I meant. She grew up differently. Her family is very American. He said it like I was something else entirely. Like I wasn't the woman who carried him, fed him, worked 3 jobs to keep him in school uniforms and extracurriculars while his father worked overtime. Like my roots, my history, were an inconvenience he now had to explain away. And you? I asked quietly. Which family do you feel closer to? He hesitated, just for a second. But a second was enough. Mom, don't make this a cultural thing, he said finally. I'm just asking you not to take things so seriously. Don't make it bigger than it is. But it was already bigger. It had grown overnight, filling spaces I didn't even know were empty. He stood up soon after, giving me a quick kiss on the head, the kind reserved for hurried visits and obligations. Just try to be patient with her, he said at the door. I watched him walk away, realizing with a quiet ache that he was trying to live in 2 worlds, one shaped by me, the other shaped by her. And he didn't yet see that he was slowly drifting toward the one that required him to shrink the parts of himself that came from me. When the door closed, the silence returned. This time it felt heavier, because now I understood the truth. It wasn't just my accent she didn't respect. It was the part of him that came from me. The gathering was supposed to be light-hearted, a simple weekend get-together with cousins, nieces, nephews, people who had known me my entire life. I cooked more than necessary as always, filling the house with the smells that had carried our family through holidays, graduations, and all the in-between moments that stitched us together. Laughter drifted from the living room, the kind born from familiarity and old stories. I felt a brief comfort settle over me, a reassurance that some places, some people, still held pieces of my past tenderly. My son arrived with his wife a little later than everyone else. She walked through the door with an air of confidence, as if she were entering a space meant to be impressed by her. I greeted them warmly, giving my son a quick hug and offering her a smile she barely returned. She scanned the room, eyes quick and assessing, then joined the younger cousins clustered near the dining table. I stayed busy in the kitchen, replenishing dishes, making sure everyone had drinks, listening to the familiar hum of overlapping conversations. It was only when I stepped into the doorway between the kitchen and dining room that I heard her voice rise above the rest. She was telling a story, one I instantly recognized as she reenacted the moment from our dinner days earlier. But this time she wasn't just mocking my words. She was performing. She stretched out my accent, twisting it into something almost cartoonish, adding dramatic gestures for effect. Her face contorted, her voice rising into a pitch that wasn't mine but was meant to be me. She shook her shoulders, added a silly expression, and repeated the line I had said so simply that night at the table. "You want more stew," she said, dragging the vowels until they lost all shape. The younger cousins burst into laughter, the kind of loud, unrestrained laughter that feeds off itself. They weren't trying to be cruel. They were swept up by the performance, unaware that each laugh chipped away at something inside me. But I felt it, sharp and unmistakable, the way a person feels the thin crack forming in something they thought was unbreakable. My son stood nearby, hands in his pockets. He didn't laugh. But he didn't stop it either. I watched his eyes. He saw me in the doorway. I knew he did. There was a flicker, of guilt, of discomfort, of something he didn't yet have the courage to name. But he still stayed silent. She hadn't noticed me yet. She kept going, repeating the line again, exaggerating the accent even further, encouraging the cousins to mimic it with her. One of them tried, failing to match her flair, making the group laugh even harder. My name became tangled in their amusement. My voice, my real voice, was nowhere in the room. My dignity slipped quietly, inch by inch, like sand falling through a sieve. Not because they mocked me. I had lived long enough, endured enough to survive mockery. But because my son, my own flesh, my first word and my hardest sacrifice, watched it happen and chose the easy path of silence. Finally she turned and saw me standing there. Her laughter tapered off, but only slightly. She put a hand on her chest, smiling as if she had been caught doing something harmless. "Oh, we were just joking," she said. "Your accent is cute." Cute. A word she threw at me like a bone tossed to a dog. The cousins shifted awkwardly, embarrassment slowly washing over them as they realized I had heard every word. One of the younger ones mumbled an apology under her breath. The others pretended to be distracted by the food. My son stepped forward as if to say something, but the words never came. I smiled, a small, tight smile, because pride is sometimes the only armor a person has left. I nodded, picked up an empty tray, and carried it back to the kitchen. My hands did not shake, but something inside me did. Inside those walls, surrounded by the smells of my past and the memories I had built with my own hands, I let myself feel it fully. The sting of disrespect, the coldness of watching my own child stand between two worlds and choose the one that laughed at me. And for the first time I wondered, not if I belonged in that room, but if they deserved to belong in mine. Long after the guests had left, after the dishes were washed and the laughter that mocked me had dissolved into memory, I sat alone in the dimness of my living room. The quiet wrapped around me like an old blanket, familiar and heavy. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the silence guide me back to a place I hadn't visited in a long time, my childhood. My first language was the sound of home, warm, textured, full of rhythms and cadences shaped by the hands that raised me. My mother spoke it while stirring pots over open fires, singing stories her own mother told her. My father used it when he taught me the names of trees, the proper way to greet elders, the prayers whispered at dawn. Our village was small, but our voices were big, sharp, unpolished and proud. My accent didn't begin as an accent. It began as the purest sound I knew, the way a child hears the world for the first time. I remembered running barefoot through dust paths, calling out to my siblings with words that carried through the wind like music. I remembered sitting in school, my tongue stumbling over English letters, feeling the sting of failure when the teacher corrected me. But I also remembered the moment I learned to read a full sentence in English by myself. I ran home and recited it proudly to my parents, who didn't understand all the words but understood what it meant. Possibility. Later, when I left home for a new country at 19, my accent was a bridge between two worlds. It carried my mother's teachings, my father's pride, and the sound of the life I had left behind. It reminded me that I came from people who fought hard and prayed harder, who endured droughts, storms, hunger and grief, yet still managed to laugh loudly and love fiercely. In those early years abroad, my accent wasn't something I thought about unless someone else pointed it out. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they leaned in as if I were speaking through a fog. But I learned to stand tall, because every syllable I spoke carried the weight of sacrifices my parents made so I could have a chance at a life bigger than theirs. I worked jobs where no one bothered to learn my name, only the lady with the accent. I saved every dollar, often sending half back home because duty was more important than comfort. I raised my son with two languages, mine and the one I fought so hard to master. When he was little, he used to say he loved the way I spoke, that my voice sounded like stories. I would stroke his hair and tell him that our language, our tone, our way of speaking, was not something to hide. It was proof that we came from somewhere. Now, years later, hearing my accent turned into a joke, twisted, exaggerated, tossed around casually, felt like someone mocking the hands of the grandmother who braided my hair, the voice of the father who worked himself sick so I could go to school, the land that shaped me. They didn't know that each time they laughed, they were laughing at people who had never wronged them, at dreams planted long before they were born. My accent was not a flaw. It was not a punchline. It was a survival story. Memory. A map of where I began. A legacy I carried in every breath. And as I sat in the quiet, the shame I felt earlier began to fall away. In its place rose something steadier, older, and unbreakable. Pride. Because the truth was simple. They mocked what they couldn't understand. But what I carried in my voice was something they could never erase. The call came on a quiet morning, the kind where the sunlight enters the house slowly and gently, touching the furniture like it's asking permission. I was washing a few dishes left from breakfast when my phone buzzed on the countertop. I glanced at the screen and saw my cousin's name. She rarely called. We usually exchanged short messages or spoke during holidays. A real call meant something was wrong. I answered with a smile in my voice, trying to sound lighter than I felt. She greeted me warmly, but her tone held a tension I noticed immediately. There was a pause, one long enough for my stomach to tighten before she even spoke the words. "I heard something," she began, her voice uncertain, almost apologetic. "And I don't want to upset you, but I think you need to know." My hands stilled in the soapy water. I leaned against the counter, bracing myself. "Just say it," I told her, because experience had taught me that the waiting was often worse than the truth. She hesitated again. "They were talking about your daughter-in-law at the gathering last weekend. Apparently." She took a slow breath. "Apparently she's been telling people that you're too traditional, that you make her uncomfortable, and that she's trying to convince your son to distance himself." The words hit with a quiet force, the kind that doesn't knock you down but makes the ground beneath you shift. I didn't speak right away. I just stared out the window at the small patch of garden I tended every morning. The flowers looked suddenly blurry, as though the colors had faded without warning. My cousin rushed on, trying to soften the edges. "I don't believe any of that. You're one of the kindest people I know. But I thought with everything that's happened, you should be aware. Embarrassing in public." She said the phrase carefully, like she was holding something fragile. I repeated the words silently in my head. Embarrassing. Traditional. Words she must have tried on her tongue before wearing them boldly in front of others. Words that revealed who she really was when I wasn't in the room. I thanked my cousin gently, reassuring her I wasn't angry at her for passing the message along. But inside something was unraveling, slowly, thread by thread. Not because of the insult, but because the intentions behind it were now painfully clear. It wasn't just mockery. It wasn't just ignorance. It was strategy. She wasn't laughing at my accent because she found it amusing. She was laughing because it served a purpose. To belittle me, to shrink me, to turn me into someone unworthy of space in my son's life. If she could make him believe I was an embarrassment, then it would be easier for her to peel him away from me, the way a person peels fruit from its skin, slowly, deliberately, until nothing familiar remains. I thought about the way my son stood silent during the gathering. The way he asked me not to take things so personally. The way he avoided my eyes when she mocked me. He was already slipping, already shifting toward her version of the world. The dishwater cooled as I stood there, hands submerged but numb. My cousin's voice softened at the other end of the line, offering comfort, reassurance, loyalty. I appreciated it, even if I could barely respond. When the call ended, I dried my hands carefully, almost mechanically, and moved to the table where my morning tea had gone cold. I sat down and finally let the truth settle fully into my bones. My daughter-in-law didn't want to coexist. She wanted to erase me. And my son, my only child, was standing on the edge, unsure which hand to hold. For the first time since this began, a quiet resolve formed inside me. Not anger and not fear, but something steadier, something inherited from the women who raised me. If she wanted distance, she would soon discover I was not as easy to push aside as she believed. And I had a language she didn't understand, one she would never control. I wasn't even supposed to hear it. Some truths arrive gently, but others slip into your life through cracks you didn't know existed. That day, I was simply watering the small row of plants along the side of my house, the same place where my son used to chase butterflies when he was little. The air was warm, the kind that softens your shoulders and makes you slow down without thinking. I didn't expect company. I didn't expect voices. I certainly didn't expect my name to be the centerpiece of a conversation meant to stay hidden. Their car pulled up quietly, though I didn't notice it until I heard her voice. She was on the porch with my son, speaking fast, the way she always did when she was trying to push an idea before he had time to question it. I moved closer to the window, not out of nosiness but instinct. There was something urgent in her tone, something sharp-edged. "I'm telling you it makes sense," she insisted. "Your mom is living in a house way too big for her. She doesn't need all this space. And the market is good right now. My son didn't answer immediately. I could picture him rubbing his forehead, torn between loyalty and discomfort. He pressed on. Think about what we could do. We could finally move somewhere nicer, somewhere with space, somewhere modern. We could start our lives properly. Properly. As if the life she married into was somehow improper. My heart thudded against my ribs. The hose slipped from my fingers, water spilling freely onto the soil. I took a small step closer to the window, staying hidden behind the curtain. Look, she continued, lowering her voice, but not enough. She's getting older. She doesn't need all this responsibility. Selling the house would be doing her a favor. Favor. The audacity almost stole my breath. My son sighed. I don't know. It's her home. Yes, she replied quickly. But she'll understand if you explain it properly. She trusts you. And once the baby comes someday, we'll need a better place. Do you really want to raise a family in that cramped apartment when your mother is sitting on a whole house she barely uses? There it was. A plan dressed up as practicality. Manipulation disguised as concern. A strategy hanging on the hope that my son's conscience could be bent with enough pressure. I just think, she continued, that if she really cares about our future, she'll want to help us build it. I felt the words like a physical blow. Not because she wanted a better life. Anyone can want that. But because she framed my existence as an obstacle to hers. Because she saw my home not as the place where I raised him, cried for him, cooked for him, nurtured him, but as real estate waiting to be harvested. My son spoke again, his voice soft. I don't want to hurt her. She'll be fine, she snapped gently, the way someone snaps a twig in half without thinking. She just needs to learn to let go. She's too attached to old things. Old ways, old habits, old languages. This is about moving forward. Too traditional. Embarrassing. Now inconvenient. The pieces fell together with terrifying clarity. The mockery, the gossip, the push for distance. It all led to this moment. She didn't just want space from me. She wanted my son's loyalty. His inheritance. His identity. She wanted everything that connected him to the life he came from. And the house was her first target. I stepped back from the window, my breath shaking in my throat. Not from fear, but from a rising understanding. This wasn't petty dislike. This wasn't misunderstanding or clashing personalities. This was a plan. Calculated. Deliberate. Disguised under smiles and soft insults. And as I stood there, the soil still wet beneath my shoes, I realized something with startling calmness. She had underestimated me. She thought my quietness meant weakness. She thought my accent meant ignorance. She thought my age meant surrender. But she didn't know the language I still carried. She didn't know the strength I inherited. And she had no idea that by pushing this far, she had awakened a part of me that had been sleeping for years. A part that would not be erased. For years, I let the world believe I had only one voice. The accented English that carried me through work, through motherhood, through every conversation in a country that was never quite ready to hear me as I was. Most people assumed that English, broken or smooth depending on their judgment, was all I knew. Even my daughter-in-law, sharp-tongued and sure of herself, never once wondered what other words lived inside me. She thought my accent was a flaw, a limitation, a sign of smallness. She never imagined it could be a doorway she didn't have the key to. But there was another language I kept tucked close to my chest, a language that didn't slip out unless the moment demanded something deeper than translation. It was the language of my birthplace, the one I learned not in classrooms but in fields, kitchens, markets, and on long nights when my mother told stories by lamplight. It was the language of childhood's scraped knees and prayers whispered before sleep. Every vowel was tied to something sacred. Every consonant carried the dust of roads I no longer walked. And then there was the language tied to my husband, the language he grew up speaking until the day he left his own country, searching for a chance powerful enough to pull him across an ocean. When we married, we found comfort in blending his words with mine. Our home became a tapestry woven in two languages, each honoring the other without competition. When our son was born, we gave him that gift, the ability to understand both sides of his roots, both histories, both stories. We spoke to him in a mix that outsiders couldn't follow, but he understood perfectly. His first lullabies were sung in the merging of these traditions. His first lessons were taught in tones and rhythms no one else in our neighborhood used. But when he grew older, the world got louder. School, friends, jobs, a new life pulling him forward. The languages of his parents faded into the background, not forgotten but quiet. He still understood them, every word, every warning, every blessing, but he stopped using them unless I urged him. And I stopped urging. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly to things he felt were old, outdated, unnecessary. I didn't know then that silence can sometimes be mistaken for surrender. My daughter-in-law had no idea that when I looked at her with calm eyes, there was a language inside me filled with storms she couldn't interpret. She didn't know that the accent she mocked was just the surface of a depth she had never bothered to explore. She didn't know that my words, when spoken in those old ancestral sounds, held meaning that could unravel her neat little plans in an instant. I preserved that language the way some people preserve heirlooms. Carefully, quietly, waiting for the right moment. I used it only with people who respected its weight. My husband until the day he passed. My son, in small ways, even when he grew embarrassed of using it in public. And now, as I thought of everything I had overheard, everything she had said, everything she had planned, I realized I had kept that language hidden for too long. Not because I was ashamed, never that, but because I believed I didn't need to bring it into the world again. But life has a way of circling back. And sometimes, the very thing someone mocks becomes the very thing that protects you. My daughter-in-law could twist my English into jokes meant to entertain. She could tug at my son's loyalties. She could attempt to rewrite the space I held in my own family. But the language she didn't speak, the one she wouldn't understand even if she tried, was a shield she couldn't break through. A language of my ancestors. A language of my late husband's promises. A language my son still remembered, even if he didn't use it. It was time to speak it again. Not out of nostalgia, not out of anger, but out of truth. Because in that language, there were words strong enough to pull my son back to himself, and away from the person trying so hard to erase me. I invited them over for tea on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sky sits softly and the world feels paused. I set the table with care, choosing the porcelain cups my husband and I had bought during our first year of marriage. The ones we saved for important conversations. The ones my daughter-in-law had never seen because she had never cared enough to look. I prepared everything calmly. Tea leaves steeped slowly, small pastries arranged neatly, fruit sliced with attention. I wanted no distractions, no excuses. Only truth. They arrived together, holding hands, my son looking hopeful and uncertain while she looked impatient, as though she had more important things to do than sit in the home she wished she could sell. Still, she offered a polite smile as she took a seat, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. My son sat beside her, eyes flicking around the room, searching for signs of how I felt, perhaps afraid of what he might find. We talked about small things at first, the weather, his work, her latest hobby. I nodded, smiled, played the part she expected me to play. I let her talk over me twice, interrupt me once, dismiss my comment about the garden with a soft laugh. I watched my son notice each moment, even if he didn't say anything. His shoulders tightened, his gaze shifted uneasily. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee. Then she did it. I had said something harmless, offering more tea. A simple sentence, spoken the way I had always spoken it. And just like before, she paused, smirked, and repeated the line in a distorted version of my accent. She added mockery to the curve of each syllable, stretching it out for effect, looking at my son for approval. He didn't laugh, but he didn't stop her either. That was enough. I set the teapot down slowly, the porcelain clinking gently against the tray. I folded my hands together, took a breath, and lifted my eyes to my son. Then, without warning, I spoke. Not in English. Not in the language she knew how to twist. I spoke in the old language. The one woven into my childhood, into my blood, into the vows his father whispered to me on our wedding night. The one my son grew up hearing in lullabies and quiet lessons. The one his wife did not understand and had never bothered to try. The moment the words left my mouth, the room changed. My son's head jerked up, eyes widening in recognition, surprise, and something deeper, memory. His wife blinked, confused, trying to decipher sound without meaning. I kept my gaze steady on my son as I spoke. My voice was calm, low, unwavering. I told him what I had overheard by the window, that she wanted him to sell this home, my home, the home where he took his first steps and said his first words. I told him she had been calling me embarrassing behind closed doors. I told him she was trying to turn him against his own blood. Slowly, quietly, deliberately. He understood every word. His wife looked between us, startled. "What is she saying?" she demanded. "Why is she talking like that?" I ignored her. My words were for my son alone. I reminded him of the promises his father had made before he died, the ones spoken in this same language. Promises about protecting family, about honoring roots, about not letting outsiders uproot the soil that raised him. I reminded him of the stories he used to love, the ones he had slowly abandoned to fit into a world that rewarded forgetting. I told him, in the language she could not twist or mock or dilute, that he was standing at a crossroads. That silence was not neutrality. That allowing mockery of his heritage was complicity. That selling the house was not just a transaction, it was erasure. His eyes filled with something I had not seen in a long time. Recognition. Memory. Shame. And then a rising clarity. His wife leaned forward, frustrated. "Can someone explain to me what is happening?" My son finally turned to her, his voice low. "She's talking to me," he said. "In a way you don't get to interrupt." And in that moment, just 10 seconds of shifting air, of truth spoken in a forgotten tongue, the direction of everything changed. For the first time, the distance between us began to close. And the distance between them began to widen. My son's face drained of color so quickly it was as if the truth itself had reached out and gripped him by the throat. He sat perfectly still, eyes locked on mine, his breath shallow, his shoulders tightening inch by inch as each word I spoke in our old language landed with the weight it was meant to carry. There was no softness in what I told him. No cushioning, no gentle phrasing. I laid it out plainly. Every sentence I overheard by the window, every insult she had whispered behind closed doors, every intention she had tried to hide under the guise of concern. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. He just listened, stunned, as though the ground beneath him was slipping away. With each detail I revealed, I watched pieces of his certainty begin to fracture. He had known she could be sharp. He had known she didn't always speak with kindness. But this level of calculation, this attempt to manipulate him into selling his mother's home, was something he hadn't been ready to consider. His wife, seated beside him, looked back and forth between us with rising irritation. Her eyebrows pinched together, her lips thinning into a sharp line. The more I spoke, the more uneasy she became. She could tell the tone wasn't casual. She could sense the heaviness of the words even without understanding their meaning. But not knowing the details, being shut out of the conversation entirely, began to grate on her nerves. "What are you saying?" she demanded, voice tense. "Why are you talking like that? You're obviously trying to turn him against me. You can just say it in English, you know." I didn't look at her. Kept my eyes on my son. He needed to hear this without her misinterpretations, without her interruptions, without her twisting my words into something smaller and less dangerous. His chest rose and fell uneven. "Mom, all of that really happened?" he asked in the same language, his voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching with the kind of pain that comes from betrayal rather than anger. A long silence stretched between us, an old ancestral silence filled with memory and grief. It was the silence of someone realizing he had been led down a path lined with lies. His wife huffed loudly, arms crossing over her chest. "Are you serious right now?" Are you both seriously going to have a whole conversation in another language right in front of me? This is rude. It's manipulative. And it's... My son held up a hand to stop her. Give me a moment, he said, the firmness in his tone surprising even himself. She stared at him, stunned. Are you taking her side? Based on words I didn't even hear. It's not about taking sides, he said, still not looking at her. It's about the fact that my mother is telling me something important. Oh, please, she snapped, scooting back in her chair. She's making things up because she doesn't like me. You know how she is. I know exactly how she is, he said quietly, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. And she has never lied to me. That sentence struck her like a slap she hadn't expected. Her face flushed with indignation, an indignation born not from innocence but from losing control. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, realizing her usual tactics would not work here. The more defensive she grew, the more obvious her guilt became. My son turned back to me, and the look in his eyes broke something open in both of us, a mixture of apology, sorrow, and disbelief. He reached for his cup, but his hand shook too much to lift it. He set it back down, exhaling slowly as the truth continued settling heavily onto his shoulders. He wasn't angry at me. He was angry at himself. For not seeing it sooner. For letting his silence be used against his own mother. For letting love make him blind. Why didn't you tell me right away? He asked. Because you weren't ready to hear it, I replied in the same language. His wife slammed her hand on the table. Enough. I'm your wife. You should be talking to me, not having secret conversations about me. He looked at her calmly, but there was a new distance in his eyes, a distance she had never seen before. You kept secrets first, he said. She's only telling the truth. And in that moment, before another word could be spoken, I felt it clearly. Her plan, so carefully constructed, so confidently carried, was beginning to come apart. Bread. Bread. I stood up slowly from the table, my knees steady, my hands calm. For the first time in a long while, I felt a quiet strength settle over me. Not loud, not forceful, but firm enough to anchor the room. My son watched me with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. His wife watched me with suspicion, irritation simmering under her skin. She didn't understand what had shifted, not exactly, but she sensed she was no longer in control of the moment. I walked to the hallway closet, the one no one ever touched but me. From the top shelf, I pulled down a worn, dark brown folder. The edges were soft from years of handling, the paper inside older than my son's memory. When I returned to the table, I placed it gently in front of him. He hesitated before reaching for it, as if afraid of what it might contain. These are from your father, I said softly, switching back to the language of his childhood, the language that held the truth without distortion. Things he asked me to protect until the day you needed them. His wife rolled her eyes. Seriously? Papers now. What is this, a performance? I didn't respond. The truth didn't need her permission to exist. My son opened the folder carefully. The first document he pulled out was an old property title, yellowed with age, bearing signatures in our birth language. He frowned, lifting it closer to his face. This is the house, he asked. He nodded. This home was not just ours. It was part of your father's inheritance, passed down through his family long before we came to this country. He turned another page, then another. More documents, some written in a script he recognized but had never been taught to read fluently. His wife leaned over, squinting. What is that? Why isn't it in English? She snapped. Because it wasn't meant for you, I replied gently. Her irritation cracked into something harder. Are you kidding me? You're hiding things. I'm preserving things, I corrected. There is a difference. My son found the handwritten letter next, the one his father wrote months before he died. Folded into thirds, edges softened by time. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. I watched his expression change. Confusion shifting to recognition. Recognition shifting to emotion so raw it softened the rigid lines of his face. He read in silence, his lips moving slightly. His father's words filled the space between us. That the house belonged under my name alone. That the land attached to it was a family asset dating back generations. That the savings account, quietly built over decades, was meant for him only when he proved he understood the value of where he came from. That the responsibility of legacy was not something to be taken lightly or handed over to someone who mocked their roots. His hand trembled when he set the letter down. His wife snatched another document from the folder, flipping it over uselessly. "This doesn't prove anything," she scoffed. "It's not even in English. You expect us to just trust these foreign papers?" My son's head snapped toward her, something in him breaking sharply. "They're not foreign," he said, voice low. "They're mine. They're my family's. You just never cared to learn." She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The realization was too big, too sudden, too threatening to the life she'd been trying to engineer. My son looked at me again. "Why didn't you tell me all this?" "Because your father wanted you to grow up without feeling burdened," I said. "He wanted you to become your own man first. And he believed that when the time came, you would be wise enough to understand what these papers meant." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. The house she wanted to sell. The land she dismissed as old. The assets she tried to position as help for their future. They were not hers to touch. They were not even his yet. They were protected under my name, locked behind a language she couldn't read, couldn't twist, couldn't claim. I watched a single truth dawn across his face. His father had trusted me to guard the legacy, and I had done exactly that. Silently, faithfully, until the moment it needed to be revealed. And now that the truth was on the table, literally, her plan had nowhere left to hide. I could feel the moment tightening, drawing everything in the room into a single point. Every lie she had told, every insult hidden behind a laugh, every moment my son chose silence because it was easier than confrontation. The folder lay open between us, its documents breathing truth into air that had grown too heavy to ignore. My son sat still, his hands pressed flat against the table. His eyes lowered to the words his father left behind. His wife hovered beside him, stiff with frustration, her pride too loud to let her understand the gravity of what lay in front of her. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the boy who once clung to my leg when he was afraid, the teenager who struggled to balance two cultures, the young man who tried so hard to fit into a world that demanded he leave pieces of himself behind. I saw the weight of this moment sitting on his shoulders. And I saw clearly that he didn't yet know how to choose. So I spoke to him in the only way he would truly hear me, in the language of my mother and my grandmother and the women before them. The language he understood in his bones, even when he forgot its words. "My child," I began softly, letting the syllables settle into their familiar rhythm, "you are standing at a line that cannot be crossed twice." He lifted his eyes, startled by the tone. His wife frowned, annoyed again, but I didn't let her interrupt. This moment belonged to us and to every ancestor who ever carried the burden of protecting what was sacred. "You cannot live in a home where you let someone belittle your blood," I continued, "and still call yourself a man of honor." He blinked, breath-catching. "You cannot build a life with someone who mocks the very voice that raised you," I said. "You cannot say you love your family while allowing someone else to erase it." My words were steady, each one clear and sharp. They did not waver. They did not bend. His wife slammed her hand against her thigh. "What is she saying? What is she telling you?" she demanded, voice cracking with panic. He didn't answer her. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but unshakable. "I am not asking you to choose between me and your wife. I am asking you to choose between truth and deception, between respect and manipulation, between the man your father hoped you would become, and the man she is shaping you into." His face tightened, pain flickering across it. "You must decide," I said, my voice gentler now. Will you build your future on dignity, or on the ashes of the people who stood by you when you had nothing? His wife stood up abruptly. This is emotional blackmail, she snapped. You're guilt-tripping him with some old-fashioned language he barely uses anymore. This isn't fair. My son closed his eyes for a moment, as if her voice was an echo he wanted to quiet. I didn't raise mine. I didn't need to. You know the truth now, I told him. You know her intentions. And you know mine. One of us wants to protect you. The other wants to use you. That finally cracked something inside him. His breath hitched. His hand closed into a fist. I reached out, placing my palm over his. Choose the life that honors who you are, I whispered. Not the life someone else is trying to force you into. He looked up at me, tears threatening to spill. Tears he pushed back because he had long ago been taught that men don't show fear. But this wasn't fear. This was recognition. His wife's face paled as she watched him drift toward a truth she could not fight in a language she could not reach. For the first time, she understood what she was truly up against. Not just a mother, not just an accent, but a legacy she could never rewrite. He left quietly, without dramatic announcements or slammed doors. Just a small suitcase, a few folded shirts, and the heaviness of a man stepping out of a life he suddenly realized wasn't built on what he thought it was. He didn't even come inside that day. He stood on my doorstep with tired eyes and a voice rough from sleepless nights, telling me he needed space. Not from me, he clarified, but from her. From the noise, from the pressure, from the twisting of his loyalties until he no longer recognized himself. I didn't ask questions. I simply stepped aside and let him enter, offering him the same room he grew up in, unchanged except for the dust on the window frame. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, elbows on his knees, the quiet swallowing the words he wasn't ready to speak. I could see confusion in his posture, guilt in the way his fingers tightened around each other, something like grief settling into his shoulders. He didn't need comforting. He needed stillness, something he had not felt in a long time. His wife called him again and again that evening. He didn't answer. When she switched to messaging him, her tone changed every hour, pleading at first, then demanding, then accusing. She said he was being manipulated, that he was abandoning her, that his mother was poisoning him against her. I watched his jaw harden as he read the words, each message carving deeper into the realization of who he had married. Over the next few days, her mask began to slip in ways he had never noticed before. The carefully polished charm turned brittle. The sweet voice turned sharp. She left long voicemails that swung wildly from desperation to anger. She told him he owed her loyalty, that marriages don't work when the husband runs back to his mother every time something doesn't go his way. She twisted the truth until it lost all shape, painting herself as the victim of a conspiracy she had created. My son stayed quiet. He went for long walks, sometimes circling the neighborhood twice before coming home. He helped me with small chores around the house, fixing loose hinges, sweeping the porch, trimming the plants he had ignored for years. He had forgotten how grounding simple work could be. I didn't tell him that. I just let him rediscover it. One evening he finally spoke. She doesn't want a partner, he said softly, staring at his hands. She wants someone she can steer. Someone she can mold into her idea of a husband. And you? Asked gently. What do you want? He took a long breath. Peace, he said. Respect. A home that doesn't feel like a battlefield. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a man waking up. Meanwhile, his wife's desperation grew sharper. She showed up at his workplace with tears and accusations, demanding that he come home with her. She told his friends that I had bewitched him with foreign traditions. She even called my cousin, trying to spin a new narrative, one in which she was the wounded party, and I was the villain who refused to modernize. But a story built on lies cannot stand once the truth is exposed. People began to see her clearly. Her tone, her entitlement, the way she weaponized embarrassment whenever she felt threatened. Even her parents, who had always defended her, seemed hesitant now, unsure how to manage the cracks in her performance. The final blow came when she tried to pressure him again about the house, framing it as a logical conversation instead of the manipulation it was. My son listened in silence, then asked her one simple question. "Why are you so invested in something that doesn't belong to you?" She had no answer, only anger. After that, their marriage slipped into a quiet collapse. Not sudden, not explosive. Just a slow unraveling. The thread pulled loose, inch by inch, until nothing held together anymore. My son stayed with me for weeks. He ate in silence sometimes, laughed lightly other times, healed in small ways that only a mother could notice. And though he never said it, I knew he was learning something he had forgotten under the weight of someone else's expectations. Love should not require the erasure of oneself. And a marriage built on control is not a marriage at all. It happened on an evening touched by the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel meaningful. The day had been quiet, the house warm with the comforting weight of routine. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard the soft knock at the front door. Not hurried, not anxious, just steady, familiar. When I opened it, my son stood there, not as the conflicted man who had arrived weeks ago, weighed down by confusion and guilt, but as someone who had walked through a difficult season and finally reached the other side. His shoulders were no longer hunched. His eyes, though tired, were clear. And there was something in his expression I had not seen since he was a boy. Openness without fear, honesty without hesitation. He stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him. I waited for him to speak in the language he always defaulted to as an adult, but when he opened his mouth, it wasn't English that came out. He apologized in my language. Not awkwardly, not haltingly, but with the smooth familiarity of someone reclaiming something buried but never lost. The way he said my name in that tongue cracked something inside me, something I didn't even know had hardened. The sound of it brought back years of memories. Him running through the house as a child, repeating phrases I had taught him. Him sitting on his father's lap listening to bedtime stories whispered in two dialects woven together like a tapestry. He spoke slowly, making sure every word was shaped with intention. "Mother, I see everything now," he said. "I see what she was trying to do. I see how you stayed silent because you hoped I would learn on my own. And I see how easily I let someone else rewrite the truth about you, about us, about where we come from." I didn't interrupt. I let the words sink into the room like water into dry earth. He continued, voice thickening as the weight of the weeks poured out. "When I was with her, everything felt loud. Every decision was pushed, every doubt turned into guilt, every disagreement twisted until I felt like I was failing her. But here..." He glanced around our home, at the walls lined with old photographs and the table scratched from years of family meals. "Here, I could finally hear myself again." He struggled for a moment, trying to keep his voice steady. I remembered who I was before I tried so hard to be someone else's idea of a husband. And I remembered who you taught me to be. His apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't drenched in tears or trembling hands. It was soft, steady, mature. A man's apology. Not because he had been caught in a lie, but because he had uncovered a truth he wished he had seen sooner. "I'm sorry," he said again, in the language of my parents and theirs before them. "Not only for letting her mock your voice, but for the moments I started to see you through her eyes instead of my own." My throat tightened. I placed my hand gently on his cheek, the way I did when he was young and uncertain. He leaned into the touch, something he hadn't done in years. "You came back," I whispered in our language. "That is enough." He shook his head. "No, Mother. I didn't just come back. I'm returning to the person I should have been all along." He told me how the silence away from her had cleared his mind. How her anger, her desperation, her shifting stories revealed more than she intended. How he finally saw the pattern. Her need to control, to isolate, to shape him into someone she could bend easily. "It wasn't love," he said quietly. "It was ownership disguised as affection. And I didn't see it until I stepped out of it." He told me he was filing for separation. That he had moved his things out of their apartment. That he was choosing peace over the chaos she wrapped in charm. And then he said something that settled deep into my heart. I forgot the language of home for a while. But I never stopped understanding it. And I'll never let anyone make me ashamed of it again. In that moment, the distance that had stretched between us for so long finally closed. Not with grand gestures, but with a shared language and a truth finally spoken aloud. My son didn't just return physically. He returned to himself. And he returned to me. The house felt fuller than it had in months, though only 2 plates sat on the table. I cooked slowly, letting the familiar scents rise into the air. Garlic warmed in oil, soft vegetables simmering, spices crushed between my fingers the way my mother once showed me. The quiet of the kitchen was not the heavy silence that had weighed on me before. This was a gentler quiet, one shaped by peace, by truth finally spoken, by the steady presence of someone who had found his way home. My son helped set the table, moving with a calm I had not seen in him since long before his wedding. He placed the forks on the left, the spoons on the right, then paused, looking around the room as if rediscovering each piece of furniture. The faded curtains, the old wooden chairs, the framed photographs that lined the walls, all of them reminders of a life he had drifted away from but never stopped belonging to. When we finally sat down, he bowed his head slightly before eating, a gesture from childhood he had forgotten for years. Then, without prompting, he spoke to me in our old language. Not out of obligation, not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude. Each word flowed easily, unforced, carrying with it a warm familiarity that wrapped around the room like a soft blanket. I listened, my heart full in a way I hadn't expected. Not because he had chosen me over her. Not because he had returned. But because he had remembered. Remembered who he was before someone tried to make him ashamed of it. Remembered where he came from. Remembered the voices that shaped him long before mockery tried to rewrite his identity. He told me how peaceful the past weeks had been. How it felt to breathe without waiting for someone else's approval. How he had rediscovered parts of himself he didn't even know he had lost. He spoke with honesty in the language that once lulled him to sleep. He apologized again, not for leaving, not for choosing her, but for forgetting the value of home until it nearly slipped away. I reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. The warmth between our palms carried a whole history. Our history, one built not on perfection but on resilience. We ate slowly. The food tasted the same as it always had. Yet somehow it felt different tonight. Each bite felt like reclaiming something sacred. My accent, my heritage, my stories. None of it felt heavy anymore. None of it felt like something I needed to hide or soften for someone else's comfort. The daughter-in-law was gone. The tension she brought had evaporated from the walls. But I didn't think of her. Not with bitterness, not with triumph. She had tried to cut the thread between my son and me. But she had underestimated what that thread was made of. It wasn't made of weakness. It wasn't made of shame. It wasn't made of broken English or rough vowels or misplaced stresses. It was made of survival, sacrifice, history, love carried across continents, promises made in the dark and kept in the light. A language that held generations within its syllables. My accent was not something to laugh at. It was the echo of every ancestor who lived so I could speak. It was the music of my childhood, the testimony of my journey, the proof of my endurance. And that night, as my son used the same words I once whispered into his tiny hands, I realized something with a clarity so sharp it felt like truth turning into light. My accent had saved everything. It had become the barrier his wife could not cross, the language she could not twist. The truth she could not rewrite. The bridge back to the sun I thought I had lost. When dinner ended, he kissed my forehead in the old way, murmuring a phrase from our heritage that meant, "I am home." And in that quiet, simple moment, I finally understood. You cannot mock what you never took the time to understand. You cannot erase what is rooted in the blood. And you cannot make small what was born from great sacrifice. My voice, accent and all, wasn't something to shrink. It was the legacy that endured. The legacy that protected. The legacy that remained.